Well, hey, y'all, welcome back. Another episode of Ranching Reboot. I'm joined today by Dr. Chris Grotegut. Did I say that right?
Grotegut, but that's okay.
Grotegut. Chris is a farmer, a veterinarian, and a stockman down around Hereford, Texas. And, well, we're going to talk about where we're at and where we're going here on the High Plains. So, Chris, welcome to Ranching Reboot.
Thank you, Brian.
Well, I met you at Soil Health U back in January, and that was really awesome. And just the few minutes that we had to talk, I was like, man, I really wish I could go listen to your presentation. But and I think you kind of said the same thing. But the same time I was doing my panel, you had the other half of everybody in another room. And what were you guys talking about over there?
What we were talking about was the move in our region from irrigated agriculture back toward dryland agriculture and grazing systems and things like that, and trying to give people an idea of looking at it differently. Because where we're at here on the Southern High Plains, we're very blessed with good fertile soil and flat land, and just very similar to Southwest Kansas. And yet our problems are very much the same. Hereford, Texas is a self-proclaimed beef capital of the world. Heavy on self-proclaimed, but what we've got going on here, the biggest problem we've got in this region is the Ogallala Aquifer continues to decline. And we've built this agricultural model for higher than long-term renewable or sustainable input. So the big change we're going to have to go through here is very obvious, but it's a cultural battle from the standpoint of moving businesses. I mean, we live in an area that just like other parts of the United States, they're adding packing capacity to kill more cattle, not necessarily small scale slaughter like many of us think is very viable across the United States. I know by some projections that they would increase the need for cattle if all the plants were built and running that are in this area. They'd increase the number of fed cattle by 15%. And the reason I know those numbers, I sit on our regional water planning group out of Lubbock, Texas. And so we look at lots of data. We see lots of trends. We're blessed to see the truth and the not truth given to us by government about what's really going on.
Oh, lots of cans of worms there, especially right at the end. So I hope that's a good overview. Now that maybe we have a hook set for our listeners. You said you're in Hereford, Texas. Tell me about your ranch and tell me about how you got there.
Okay, we have a very our business actually our family came to this area in 1927. I had a great uncle come. My father immigrated from Germany in 1953 to help him because he didn't have any children. Him and a cousin both came. And then I came along in the 70s and started my little piece of the deal in 1988 and buying a quarter section from a neighbor. And we've grown our business. By ranching scale, we're not big, but by farming scale, we're pretty big. It's an 11,000 acre farm in an 18 to 20 inch normal rainfall that ranges from 3 to 36. And so living through the 3-inch rainfall years and the 36-inch rainfall years, it's quite a different management scenario we get to deal with.
That's pretty similar to where we're at here as far as rainfall wise. And it just seems like, you, as far south as you are, you probably get another 3 weeks of growing season on both sides.
Yes, and we also get higher evapotranspiration rates than you guys get, and partly because of the extra days, and part of it because of the sunshine, the amount of sunshine we have here. We have a lot of sunny days, and I think that's one of the reasons that in the 50s and 60s, whenever they started trying to build feedlots and things like that, mud is a negative, and if you're grain feeding livestock, when they started that deal, there was a lot. The drought of the 50s had started. Irrigation development was big in our area. We went from an area in the well, I guess 1910 would have been the first irrigation wells actually developed with the development of the centrifugal pump. And then that was up until the 50s, it was kind of viewed as foolish, the use of money. So there were only a few farms in the area that did it. Then the drought of the 50s came. Northern Mexico was getting dry. All of West Texas was dry. These are the people that had lived through the Dust Bowl. Of course, they were just 20 or 25 years older or 30 years older at that time. And they said, basically, we're going to try something different. And pump companies came in and said, hey, if you'll drill a well, we'll finance it for you. And there were farmers that came in the area that went to individuals that were getting older, wanting to sell land, and said, hey, you finance the land, pump company's going to finance the pump. And they were getting in and farming in this area, nothing down. So it was a very lucrative place to come to, something that would be unheard of for the youth of today. And so the wells were developed, the vegetable industry came in, carrots, onions, lettuce, things like that, things that are grown in other parts of the country right now because of the water. And that continued to develop until, peak water was probably the day they drilled the first well.
Okay.
And we've been on the decline ever since in the region wide. So about 2010, it seemed to me that that we were on an asinine path to self-extinction.
Okay. What'd the farm look like then?
In 2010, it was probably 5% grasslands that were never touched, 95% farmland. That at that point we had been at least 20 years of move toward LIPA center pivot irrigation, where we're putting that water right on the ground, right above the ground, so we're minimizing the evaporation of it. The majority of the land was irrigated at that point. There were pivots all over this place, and we were growing things like white food corn, some seed milo, which would be like sorghum, Sudan grasses, and things like that people buy that they plant across the country, and a lot of wheat, and just basically anything that we could find a market for. A few beans along the way and things like that. So some cotton. I mean, we've tried a lot of different crops in my lifetime. Even in that point, we were even, going back into 30 years ago, we were still even messing with some vegetables from time to time. So, but in 2010, we made that move that we were, this is a non-sustainable viable path. We have a lot of overheads out here. And we always thought, I was raised by a family that made sure I understood the livestock industry at an early age.
Okay.
Even though that wasn't our primary method, that was always, that's where we're going at some point if we're here. And the reason the family's here in the first place is it was the place that they could get their foot in the door. So that was the bottom line of it. And so it's a wonderful climate if you can handle lots of wind and long dry periods.
I don't know about you, but the wind sometimes just really, really wears me down. A lot of days it'll just straight up blow me back into the house at about 20 mile an hour, 25.
Well, the last dust storm we had around here the other day, we basically had peak winds up to about 68 right here. Oof. And I know in the Eastern Panhandle, it's a peak gust at 114, but 68 mile an hour straight gust winds, to give you an idea for those people who don't live in these windy areas. We had a portable water tank. We have some little arena traps in front of my house, and it picked it up. It picked it up over the tree line, which these trees are probably 30 foot tall. This was an empty water tank, sitting in the corner of the pen, steel fence right there. It picked it up, lifted it up over the fence, up over the buildings, and landed on the other side of the house, leaning against the fence. No way it could have blown through that area. It went over that area.
Right. Well, we had it would have been, I think, August of 2021. I was in Colorado for the first day of about a 4-day vacation.
Mm-hmm.
I get a call from home. It's like, hey, it stormed here last night. Like, yeah. Well, here's pictures of the shed. So I had a 30 by 80 flat top shed that was built. I think it was built sometime in the 50s, maybe mid 50s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so about an 80-mile-an-hour straight line wind from the northwest got up underneath the corner of that building, picked it up in the air, wadded it up, threw half of it across the highway, about 150 yards or so,
Mm-hmm.
and threw the rest of it down in the corner of my corrals, bent them up a little bit. I mean, nothing that needed repair, but just imagine, this giant steel building get picked up by the wind and thrown across the highway. It didn't go like over; it went down the highway because there were a few scratches, and then it went down and took out some fence. But so yeah,
It was a good day not to work in the shop.
yeah, it was a good day to not be home. Apparently, the same day that happened, there was a cottonwood tree. We've got some pretty ugly big cottonwoods here too, and I don't know how old this one was, but it was pretty fair size. Um, it fell down and missed my dad's house by less than a foot.
Your
And
father's a lucky man.
yeah, and the corner that tree missed, that's where his bedroom is in that house. So yeah, I can't remember if he was home or not when that happened. He probably was, but anyway. So back to the area around Hereford, Texas. It's interesting, that you say that they used to grow vegetables around there. As I started uncovering some more history, it seems like that was a pretty common thing, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and in some areas even up until the late 70s or 80s. That farms were a lot more diverse out here in the high plains. You would find guys that were trying to grow vegetables, something other than just wheat, corn, beans, and cotton. And I think about Hereford, Texas, and it's always been my understanding that the first really, really big feedlot was built down there by Hereford in somewhere around the mid 50s. Is that track?
That'd be pretty accurate. That was one of the two that were built, I think, nationwide historically. But the one that you're alluding to, there was a small set of pens that I understand were built by the Brumley family that later then, not long far from where they were trading cattle. Okay, if we're going to talk, the one of the most world famous cattlemen, Mr. Paul Engler from Nebraska originally, was down here buying cattle from the Brumleys, the way the story goes. And he saw they were loading cattle on a train. And at the same time, they were loading milo, grain sorghum, on the train. And he goes, "This is crazy. We're loading the beef and the grain on the same train to go somewhere else to feed the cattle so that they can be harvested." I think they were going to California at the time, but I'm not sure if that's correct. I believe that's the way the story goes. But a group of investors came together with the help of Mr. Engler, who was down here buying cattle for another gentleman, and Hereford Feed Yard was built. And it was built in a location that was highly accessible to rail and things like that. Of course, the idea was not the idea that we would reach what we do today here. There is still a lot of cattle fed in this region. In Decimal County, there's usually over 900,000 head fed a year. Within 30 or 40 miles of Hereford, there's approximately, between Dimmitt and Friona, Texas, the other two neighboring towns, there's usually around 1.6 million head of cattle. And what changed that also is that about 21 years ago, actually, the first big dairy here on the Southern Plains came in into the Texas side of the equation. There had been doing some activity in New Mexico side of the state line, but it moved in. And so what we have is we have large numbers of confined animals and limited numbers of grazing animals in an ecosystem that we bring because we have lost our ability to produce the amount of grain it takes to feed that number of animals. We are now importing the grain out of Illinois, Iowa, and places like that with the help of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad and, of course, ADM, Cargill, and folks like that. So it's a very industrialized agricultural system that the Achilles heel on it is the fact it's the same Achilles heel that the row crop farmers that grew vegetables have. In the Achilles heel is the water table decline. And so we're and that's not even I will mention a can of worms that we don't have to go down, but I think it has cultural significance and national soil health significance. The way it was put to me many years ago, when we import corn, we're in lieu importing topsoil
And water.
and water. Correct. Grain is one of the cheapest ways to move a water resource around the country, and yet we're not sending the manure back to where the corn was grown. So we have enhanced the system we're in. The reality is we've enhanced mining of soils and movement of nutrients in a very, very large scale. And at this juncture, it hasn't killed our food production in our country. But I think at some point it becomes a very questionable approach. How do you maintain food production, moving all these feedstuffs around the country and not bringing it back to where that feedstuff was grown? I think that becomes where a ranch only takes a small percentage off. I mean, truly a grass-based operation. The main things that they sell, if you really break down the carcass of an animal, is fat and water. And fat is essentially carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And we're pulling carbon out of the sky, hydrogen out of the sky, and oxygen out of the sky. So we really do not pull as many nutrients out of the earth on a grazing system as we would when we're moving things in a large scale down a track. And I think that's something to think about. But taking a step back, we realizing that was the problem we have in our area, we moved our business. We decided we would, and it's not to talk about our business too much because to give them context of what we're doing with, we decided to start moving some of the farmland to grassland. Anybody at pivot farms understands if they don't have corner systems on their pivots, that those corners are 25% of the land and they're 5% of the gross revenue, typically speaking. And so they're bad math to operate. So we started putting them in grass. And we liked it so well that we started putting entire fields to grass and selling the pivots off.
Like selling the actual pivot machinery?
The actual machinery, started moving the pivots off. And quite frankly, what we really did, we sold multiples and we upgraded some units and sold multiples off. So today we went from a farm that would have had well over 60 pivots on it to a farm that has in the low 20s is where we're at now. We actually so we basically have taken 75% of our land to grass. The other is pretty much a no-till system. That's also the remaining, what's under pivot is en route to go to grass. If it's, we're at different stages on different places. Because one thing we didn't do was we have not made the habit of using irrigation water to start grasses. We just say, let's plant grass, and when it rains, it's going to come up, and we're going to let the plant succession and natural succession take care of it, along with some grazing management of things like weeds and things like that people worry about, and we call feed.
Yeah, most weeds are just good cow feed. Like
Exactly.
pigweed. Like pigweed's one that like all the corn farmers and bean farmers up here love to yell about. Like uh, that's like around 20% protein if you can get them when they're green. Cows love them. I mean that was I see a lot of quote weed management problems in farm fields around here that could be solved with just a few cows in there for just a few minutes because they would go eat those weeds and eat them down to dirt. I digress.
Well, you remind me of a quote from the late great Gordon Hazard when he addressed the South Dakota Grazing Lands Coalition years back. He said, "I've never seen a farm without weeds," or something to that effect. And I think as long as you're going to have bare ground, you're going to have those annual plants trying to come in and fill the void and do what us that like to think in the regenerative thought process uh, consider finally as good. You know, one thing we run into in our part of the world where we're as dry as we are, a lot of people like to say, well, we can't use cover crops because it's too dry here. And there is a little bit of truth to that. You can't get them all. You can't always get them up when you want to because you're bringing in uh, species that aren't used to a sub 10-inch rainfall. You know, say if you're doing it in a dry year,
Right.
but it's amazing. You can get a half-inch rain and get a beautiful stand of weeds. And so the direction we went on, we are the type that we think our most sustainable plants are focused around the native species that were here before we came, which is going back to blue grama and buffalo grass and some other grasses such as green spangletop, which actually is a repositioned grass, which was south of us more at one point, but it works really well up in here. Those kinds of grasses, and as we've seen a lot of the different kinds of grasses show, show up in our system. I mean, it's a neat thing to watch, but it's a very patient thing to watch.
I got to ask, are you planting any old world blue stems? King Ranch spar, WW spar, anything like that?
Well, let me tell you the story there. Because, okay, when I was a child, we farmed. Okay, my father actually started buying land in '69, and I was born in 1970. And over the years, we bought farms that people would put that on. So we have a corner here or a corner there of those old world blue stems remaining. And we have not added any of those old world blue stems in since probably 1981. So when I was 11 years old, would have been the last time anyone even thought about adding an old world blue stem right here. Even though there are areas they're more prevalent, I think they're a little harder to manage. I think that they have in our environment, there are periods that they're pretty useful for feed production, but carrying cattle through the winter without supplement, I think the natives have it beat 10-1 all the time. And so that's the way we look at it from a year round, because what we do, and we're a little odd here, we're not master grazers yet. We graze the cattle. We're going down this path. We basically move cattle every 3 to 7 days because that's what's easy for us. We have not put up permanent fences on the property, so we do it all with electric portable wire because that's what we had. And even though, to tell the truth on that, we have enough fencing material in the barn to build a multi-strand electric fence on the property. We just hadn't done it yet because we hadn't quite figured out how we want to lay. Even though our farm is very easy to lay out, we have a water tank in the middle of every section, and we graze basically 80s and 160s most of the time. So we graze at this point where our waters are probably a little too far from the far corner, but it's manageable. So we're a half mile from any side, so we're a little over a half mile to the furthest corner, and we graze them a quarter section at a time. And so we move cattle once or twice a week, depending on what we're on. When it's growing fast, we move a little faster, and when it's this time of year, we're grazing pretty slow because we don't know when our next rain is, and we're pretty simple. We count quarter sections of feed of grass and weeds ahead of us, and say, okay, this is how many weeks worth of feed we've got till we hit this drought management point that we have to destock X percentage. So that's how we look at it. We look at it as an inventory management deal as much as anything, which is truly the way we manage it. So
Okay. I help me kind of paint a picture here. When you talk about that the farm used to have like 60 odd pivots, I'm thinking everything's on a section line. Everything's on a section line broken up into quarters, and there's roads everywhere.
that's exactly correct.
Okay. So you might have, how many of your acres are continuous?
All of them.
All of them. Okay. So even though they're all continuous, you still have to deal with like probably a lot of county roads.
Yes, we still deal with county roads, and we're known. Yes, and we have a state highway running through us also that we get to deal with, and deal with people on those lines.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a lot of infrastructure. There's more road infrastructure than we need for our future in reality, but it makes checking livestock and moving things around very, very fast.
And most of that you don't have to maintain.
Yeah, that's correct. But sometimes they need help.
Can't disagree.
County government sometimes need help in certain spots.
Can't disagree. I let's talk about the grasses that we kind of went off on the old world bluestem tangent, and
what's your thoughts on them?
I think old world bluestem's a horrible grass.
Thank you.
Like my dad kind of went on a crusade against it several years ago, and I finally convinced him to quit spraying it about 4 years ago. Because after years of spraying, like we sprayed one test patch that we marked out. We sprayed it to bare soil 3 years in a row, and then let it go. Guess what? Guess what's there now? Old world bluestem.
Or bluestem.
I mean, anywhere where we sprayed it, it's still there. So it didn't work. We spent money, we spent time, we put toxic chemicals on the soil, and it didn't work. And Dad was like, well, the cows won't eat it. Cows won't eat it. Cows won't eat it. Well, guess what? I found a bunch of cows that will eat it. So I've got cows that'll eat it. I mean, September, October when it's nice, but the rest of the year they've kind of left it alone. You throw enough protein to them, they'll go after it. And we talked earlier that, we're in a very similar rainfall environment, that 18 to 22 inches, which is really, 30 to 36. I think the lowest I've ever had is probably something like 10 or 11. But, we've had years that's, just on top of 40. We get about the same summer as you do. We just have about 3 weeks less of it. And here, in addition to all the grasses you listed, the blue grama, the hairy grama, side oats grama, I think you said buffalo grass too. And there's
we have a lot of side oats and buffalo. Yeah.
There's probably another one in there you mentioned and I forgot.
The green sprinkle top. Yeah.
Well, I don't have that, but
that's a cool one.
I do have little blue stem, big blue stem, Indian grass, and I'm starting to get switchgrass, which, the Indian grass and the big blue stem can be just a tremendous amount of volume per acre. I mean, they're patches that would be close to 6,000 pounds of forage per acre, if you clipped at ground level and weighed. I mean, 6-7 foot tall grass, it's awesome. getting them to use that in the wintertime is kind of a challenge. Like you got to throw a lot of protein to them. So that's a lot of what I'm working off of is the warm season grasses, the big five warm season grasses, side
Mhm.
oats, big blue, little blue, Indian and switch. Like that's what I like to see, and that's kind of like what I managed for. Do you guys do you have a lot of tall grasses down there, or is that just called corn in your neighborhood?
No, well, corn is the predominant tall grass, but it's going away in lieu of forage sorghums, but not necessarily so much on us. We actually see some tall grasses. I'll tell you, there's historical. My great uncle, who when he came here, he talked about the story. I never knew the man because he died a few years before I was born, but he talked about when he first came that there were times that the native grasses were taller than the cattle. And that was a pretty common sight that the cattle, you would lose your cattle in the grass because the grass was really strong. And we have a former mayor here who passed away a few years ago during this pandemic period, and his father had ridden horseback through here, moving horses across here before there were any fences, and that family was out of southern Kansas, around the area of Pratt, and he said that area had amazing grass
I,
through here.
hold up, the area south of Pratt. That's where I am.
Well, around Pratt, yeah.
What
Our
was the guy's
former
name?
mayor was a man by the name of Bob Josserand, who was the former NCBA president. And they are actually his son. One of his sons is the current owner of the initial Hereford feed yard.
Okay.
So they came here. I believe they came here in the seven in after the 73, 74 cattle wreck is when they kind of really got their feet on the ground here. But amazing man, did great things for our community. Um, and of course, and what's interesting about that gentleman is he of course, did really well feeding cattle. And at one time was a top five cattle feeder. And later in his life, him and his son John, they really were moving toward uh, cows on grass-based systems, and they still had these feeding facilities, but they were moving away from that. And I think they could see the future just like we could see the future. That those there's places for those systems, but they don't hold the same magnitude that they once did. Looking out 40 or 50 years down the road from now, because the way, if we look about where we're at right now, the most water efficient plants, other than a pigweed, pretty darn water efficient as far as pounds of tonnage produced per inch of water. Hence why its ability to outgrow most crops it ever shows up in. Uh, the next most obvious thing, besides those annual weeds that come in and fill the soil, I mean, cover the soil and put the band-aid on and buy us some time to get the grasses reestablished and things like that. It would be our native species that once covered this great savanna. And I think what we'll see going forward over time, we see a little bit of it already. We start seeing more tall grasses showing up in places over time. And one thing that we did see, we did have, I will tell you this on your old world blue stems. The most successful moment we had on a place that we have that has, it was a, oh, there's probably two corners of pivot. So between 14 and 20 acres of old world blue stem that was put in a long, long time ago. Um, During the drought of 2011 and 12 here, which actually started in July of 2010 in our neighborhood. Uh, 11 was worse further south, not as bad further north, and then got worse further north. And we improved somewhat in 2012 further south. Um,
Was that
we
drought
actually saw old world blue stem patches go away because of in 2011 we had 3 inches of rainfall. And on the end of May of 2013, when we actually got our first good rain, the first thing we had where that old world blue stem was this wonderful uh, stand of blue grama
Where?
waiting in the wings to come in. Yes, it was. And the only source of blue grama seed was across the road of a piece of ground around a playa lake that had never been interrupted. And so there is hope on these old world blue stems that they're not totally adapted to our region. There is some hope that they're not going to take it over. I know we've seen that. I know that's been a big concern in our amongst native grass owners with CRP nearby that was put in the early 80s in CRP because there was a lot of old world blue stems put in that period because of CRP.
Yeah, I
And
know that.
and so um, I'm just fortunate that our family wasn't big participants in the CRP program at that time. And a lot of our neighbors weren't either. So that helped us a lot. Uh, but we've had a lot, we're like a lot of rural areas. We've had a lot of attrition in rural agriculture, not of a lot of consolidation amongst farms. A lot of this get bigger, get out, which is a economic fallacy. Um, for a lot of people because you make money in agriculture on a small scale, you make money on agriculture on a large scale. If you do it well, you're going to do well on either scale. And if you do it poorly, you'll lose money on either scale. And, but looking at it, where we're at today, what we learned through this process, I guess we're 13 years into this experiment, and that's what it is. It's a big experiment, Brian. And the
Everything's experimental.
everything's experimental. And so our experiment here was to see, can we survive making it go to taking an irrigated farm back to predominantly dryland grass-based production, because that's where we thought we were going. And I've got two little boys that are now 15 years old. So they were little when we started this experiment, 3 years old. And it seemed to me that the best thing we could do was for me to take the blunt of the blow of changing. So if they decided they liked it, that they didn't have to. Okay. And what we did, what we've learned, I mean, this is the coolest part about what we've learned. As we reduced our pumping and as we reduced our pivots and more grass we put in, we started seeing recovery of our Ogallala.
Can you explain that?
Yes. So here was the deal. It's pretty well documented in the areas of the Ogallala that there are areas that recharge. They recharge at a rate of at variable rates. I mean, from the textbooks here will say, or the water districts here will say 0.54 to 0.8 inches of water per year. And in our world, it looks like it's more like 1.8 inches. So nearly 10% of our annual rainfall. So it's changed our goal quite a bit on our farm. Our goal is to keep 90% of the water on the land to grow grass or grow whatever crop we're growing. We still do grow some wheat. Believe it or not, we still grow wheat. Um, but and I
I,
like it because you can cut it and graze it either way.
I'm not gonna. Look, I mean, if I had a couple thousand acres and all the stuff, the tractors, drills that I needed, I'd probably be doing that too. But that's not ever been in any part of my context, so I'm not gonna go spend money to do that. I mean, wheat's just a cool season grass, and
Yes.
if you have a little bit of moisture, it's pretty dadgum dependable.
Well, in what we've learned is if you can grow, the nice thing about wheat is you're growing it during it's on the ground, it's in the ground a long time, and B, um, you're growing it mostly during your lower evapotranspiration period. So yeah, it's not as water efficient per bushel as corn. That's the whole hallmark of corn. Corn is extremely efficient from a bushel per inch of water perspective, but it takes a lot of water to get the first bushel on corn. And so a lot of farmers have grown corn because A, it's easy, and B, it's easy, and C, it's easy. And we've got a lot of technology and a lot of advertising and a lot of demand or thought up demand or created demand for the product. So it's an easy to sell. It's an easy product to sell. But going away from that, if you get rid of your, if you to give me here's a context for you. You're talking about tractors. Okay, when we started this project in 2010, we were running 5 high horsepower tractors,
Okay.
and handful of little ones for uh, working on fences, putting out feed, fixing wells, things like that. Okay. Today, we have 1 high horsepower tractor.
Okay.
We went from multiple drivers to one person working full time on the farm. Besides, because I'm a practicing veterinarian, I spend part of my day on the farm, part of my day at my practice or on somebody's place helping them. And
We'll get back to your vet practice later.
oh, that's going to be dicey. but it's amazing when you go through that change of reducing irrigation. You got to reduce cost, and when you reduce cost, you reduce labor, reduce overheads, you reduce dependence upon uh, high tech agriculture. Even though we incorporate the we were very early adopters in the steering technology and all of that stuff. I mean, that was a no-brainer in our mind because it was a labor savings device that allowed me to run in the middle of the night without running over something I didn't want to run over. And because we have a lot of dust, if you were doing tillage, which we did do at that time, you couldn't see. Tractor surrounded by dust.
I have some distant cousins that are just north of me, about 15 miles, and they haven't called in a few years. I wonder why. Probably because their kids are getting old enough to help. But I used to go up and help them cut wheat, help them work ground, help them plant wheat, help them do corn, help them do beans, and yeah, I've been there at after dark in a field, completely surrounded with dust, had no idea where I was, just made sure the GPS was doing its thing, and it makes life easy.
And you didn't know what direction you were going. Always.
Yes.
It can get a little disoriented too in the morning.
Yep.
But as long as you stayed on your line, you were good.
Yep. Yep. As long as you
Yeah.
stay on that line and it's inside the boundaries of the big box, you're good. Just keep it rolling.
Yes. And it was the life we've lived, and it's still lived by a lot of people here in the plains. And
The kids
so
these days just watch YouTube and TikTok while they're farming. I know
that's true.
I know a guy that plays Farm Simulator while he's farming on GPS. He'll sit there and play Farm Simulator so he can farm while he's farming.
That's pretty interesting. That's a pretty serious farm addict.
Yeah.
That is pretty serious addiction problem.
Well,
But I guess if you thought about it, you can do your banking and everything else with your cell phone anymore, and have been for quite a while. Um, I guess it's cheaper for him to play Farm Simulator than it is for him to do online gambling,
probably.
unless he's good at it.
I don't know anybody that really is. I'm good at gambling, not at Farm Simulator.
Well, they have you back. The math is working against you, and if you can beat their math, then good for you. That you're a better mathematician than they are.
Well,
But
I understand the math. That's why I don't go gamble.
7% take, depending on what the game is.
Yeah, and over the long term, then they're going to get theirs. Yeah, I've never worried about that. I've never been a big gambler.
It's the way we're supposed, that getting a percentage every time we do a deal is the way we're supposed to try to do it here in the cattle business
Well, I
or
guess
the sheep business or whatever else.
I've never been a gambler in the sense of, casinos or cards, but there's enough gamble every day in the cattle market, just waking up and going to work and hoping we get some rain and grow some grass. There's lots of gambles that, we take as, in farming and ranching every year that we don't always necessarily see as a gamble.
Well, it's like that paradigm right now. Okay, it's dry. Do you listen to the grazing guru of Jim Garish and destock? Or do you maintain an inventory knowing just so you have a foothold to stay in the game once it does rain?
You know, that's been the question for, gosh, I don't know, 6, 7 months. You know, like you talked about, the drought 10 years ago. You know, you guys started to feel it in 2010. I felt it in 2010. Okay. I destocked a little bit in 2010, which means I had a destock less in 2011. When 2012 came and it was super dry, it was just another incremental destock. It wasn't, a huge drop. You see it coming, you start planning early. And this one, like we've been in this drought for 30 months already. And it was last August. I put some social media out about, like, if you don't have enough forage to get your animals back to green grass next spring, you need to figure that plan out
Exactly.
now and not wait till December, January, or February when you run out and hay is $300 on the open market. You better have a plan now to feed those animals. Yeah, I caught a lot of heat, caught a lot of hate. I don't care. I can take it. I have fairly thick skin. When it does get to me, I just log off and don't log back in for a couple weeks, and everything dies down and it'll be fine again. But it seems like guys don't they're not in tune with the larger weather climate picture and patterns and what's going on with them. And you know, to some extent, when you're feeding your cattle a crop that you're growing under irrigation in a feedlot, well, why do you care how much it rains? You just go turn on the irrigation, make another lap, and irrigate the corn a little bit more. But for guys like you and I, you know, there's a big difference in getting 12 inches of rain versus 20 inches of rain. And also, there's also something to be said about the timing of that rain. Like, a lot of rain during the dormant season might not do a whole lot of good. It's not going to grow a lot of grass. Will it put moisture in the profile? Sure. Will it recharge aquifer? In your case, probably. But is it going to grow a lot of spring grass? Not really. Like, we need rain right now to really get our spring grass growing and to get our summer grass started. So, and you know, so we're talking about irrigation, and that's kind of your wheelhouse, right? And we talk about feeding corn, and that's why all the feedlots, that's why the big feedlots are in the Texas Panhandle, and they're building a bunch of big dairies there now because they think they're going to be able to continue to grow, quote, cheap feed with water, with irrigation water. And from everything that I understand, I mean, Kansas, we're not any different. There's places in Kansas that are the same situation that Texas Panhandle, West Texas is in with irrigation water. The wells keep dropping. And occasionally, some go dry. And it's a deal all the way to eastern Colorado. What do we do when these irrigation wells start running dry? Nobody's answering that question. It's just pump, 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 pump. And to me, it's madness that we're going to take water from several hundred feet down that's been there for tens of thousands of years, and we're going to pump that using energy that's millions of years old to spray on corn, to haul to an animal that's standing in a feedlot. Like, it doesn't make sense. Somewhere along the lines, we're going to realize that there's a lot of efficiencies and not efficiencies. There's a lot of inefficiencies in that system that we're just blind to.
I heard a deal the other day that was kind of interesting, and it said that 76% of the people on Earth that live in extreme poverty uh, live in a natural resource deprived area.
Okay.
Okay. So are we not creating natural resource deprived areas when we pump the water tables dry? And are we not creating a real problem for society in the plains if we don't more judiciously manage or think about water? Because in Texas, I mean, can I give you a quick brief overview of it?
Okay.
Texas, you own the land, you own the water underneath it. As long as you don't you view it wastefully by the state, you're going to maintain that right to own that water unless someone comes along, buys the land or buys the water right. And each state along the Great Plains is a little bit different, but probably my favorite one, the way I understand it, is you know um, of course, Nebraska's got the sand hills and they've got the recharge of sand hills, but there's spots there they have along the Platte that they've got water problems or having adequate supplies. Further east you get in that state, the better off they are. But you get into South Dakota, and the rule that I understood that they had was you can't take more than it recharges. And I think the reality of the plains is we're going to have to get back to you can't take more than it recharges, and you need to do it before we get down to the level of just recharge only, because your well capacities are going to be gone. If you do it way before then, you maintain higher well capacities. So that means if you do have to irrigate a crop or get water quickly to an area, say you need a high flow pump going to water your cattle on pasture because you're running Brian Alexander's running 1,000 cows per grazing group, and they drink a lot of water really fast. You know, we lose that ability if we get down to 3 gallon a minute wells.
Yeah.
If you have 100 or 200 gallon a minute wells or 500 gallon a minute wells, then watering livestock is a no brainer, easy situation. And so we're actually making it less livable from even a grassland, dryland perspective by thinking it's okay to pump it down to oblivion. And the other part about the deal, uh, if we produce, the reality is the biggest fallacy in American agriculture is that we quote feed the world, and we need to feed our communities first. And if we feed our communities, then we've done our job as agriculturists in a community. And so, that being said, we are going to have to continue to move forward, thinking about how we get away from the lie, because we haven't solved anything if we don't teach other people to feed themselves. All we're doing is displacing the problem and making them dependent on us. And when we can't supply them in the future and we made them dependent on us, our friend becomes our enemy. And you know, so I think we need to think in more terms of how do you balance food production needs with food production demands, and don't grow food for the sake of just growing extra food. So that we can keep people employed in the food sector.
Good points. Good points. So, couple things. I think it's something. It's close to 80%, maybe a little more. Close to 80% of the world's food is grown by small subsistence farmers.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right, and I've been saying it for a long time. We don't feed the world. Like let's like that narrative sucks. I don't even like that term anymore. I don't. Yeah, they're starving pygmies in New Guinea. Great, that sucks. There's a lot of starving children in Chicago, in Kansas City, in Dallas. I mean, there's huge homelessness problems. Why are we worried about feeding the world when we can't even take care of our communities? Granted, big cities, they kind of come with their own sets of problems. But I also want to jump back to the comment you made about 76% of people globally live in poverty or in a natural resource poor environment. I would argue that that includes us. That if
You're
you
probably
are,
right.
that if you're not on the Pacific coast and you're west of the 98th meridian, you're in a natural resource poor environment that experiences that can have 3 to 40 inches of rain. And I think that's the reality from the front range of the Rocky Mountains to the 98th meridian. And the reason it's habitable here for us is because we have tapped into these underground water sources, and we have the energy and we have the industrialization and the machinery to be able to pump that water out and use it. And that circles back to like a responsibility thing. Like, I really appreciate your philosophy and what you're saying, that, you know, some of your wells are recharging, or, you know, they've at least stopped dropping and they're starting to recharge. The question I have, you talked a little bit about Texas water rights, and it's very similar to what they're in Kansas, but there's no such thing as like as a separate water right from the land here. And I get the sense that there might be, you know, that might be a thing in Texas. If it's not, that's cool. But what I'm asking is, what, like, you can drill a well down the Ogallala on your property. Is there any kind of limit on how much water you can pump out of that?
Well, yes. Okay, here's how it works. We're very lucky that we were okay. The community I'm from was the first community, or was one of the first communities to get involved in starting water districts. Okay, the good, the bad, the ugly, that go with them. The way they chose to manage them in our area, and they still manage them this way today, is by well spacing. So, Brian, if you and I are neighbors and I permit to go get a well, you can't get mad at me and drill a well right across it from it. They're going to make you go back so many feet, you know, and it's all dependent on the capacity that you're asking out of that well. Truth of it today is the true limits are the limits of the earth's ability to supply the water that go to that hole. We have way better pumping technology than we have the ability to pull all the water out of the earth at one given time. So depending upon what the substrate is, whether it's sand and clay or rock, determines how fast it comes out of there as much as anything, along with actual amount of saturated thickness. And one thing people don't understand, and we see this a lot with people, we have a net migration into these urban areas. I mean, you know, in the Great Plains to the bigger cities in the Great Plains that sit where there's plains on both sides of it. It's not on the edge of the plains. Would be Amarillo, Texas, and Lubbock, Texas. And both those towns are seeing quite a lot of growth, and the surrounding communities are seeing quite a lot of growth. And people are coming here from other parts of the United States to live because they like sunshine and they like low land prices compared to where they may have been. And they hear, oh, I'm buying a place that has 50 feet of water underneath it. No, it's 50 feet of saturated thickness. And Kansas data, from what I've read, they like 17% probably. In Texas, we like to say 15%. Well, so we're going to use 15%. What's 15% of 50? It's 7.5 feet. So you have 7.5 feet of
7.5 feet deep.
yeah.
Okay.
And so from the corn farmer perspective, and I'm not bashing corn. Corn's just a crop. You know, cattle are cattle, corn's corn. I mean, plants are plants. They all have their place. They all can be managed well or managed poorly. And but if you're using a crop that uses 2 feet of water per year, you're 4 crops away from being dry if you didn't have any recharge. That's not a long-term business plan, Brian.
I agree.
And so people are building houses in places that they don't necessarily understand what they're getting into because they're not buying enough gallons to meet their long-term needs. And people are financing them so that here's, you know, through banks and things like that. Well, if truly banks are a collection of other people's money and a collection of printed money by clicking a mouse today or a touch screen or whatever to say we're making this loan to this person to buy this $500,000 house. What happens if those houses don't have any water? Are they going to walk away from those houses? Are they going to put up storage tanks? Are they going to put rainwater collection systems? What happens? And what about if you happen to own a ranch and you need to borrow some money? And of course, what people don't understand is, uh, I'm gonna use you for the fun of it.
Go
That
ahead.
Brian Alexander owns a ranch that he makes a living on, and uh, say he's a really good rancher and he gets a 5% net return on his asset, and but he had to go borrow some money because of the drought to buy some extra feed. And the bank said, okay, you're signing a note for this collateral on this deal, and you're going to pay it no matter what. And wow, you have a nice net worth at the bottom. Well, the banker just kind of makes sure that it's collateralized with the paid for ranch. And then they get to show that as an asset on their book, even though you borrowed $100,000 for feed. Well, what happens? You get 5 or 6 more of these dry periods, and that 100,000 turns into 1 million. And at the same time, these people that built these houses are throwing the keys back at the bank. Well, it puts us all in a jam if the banks can't, if we get into a position where the banks can't function properly because of poor developing, poor thinking, poor education about where we really are. You know,
We
I know.
that
Go
already
ahead.
almost happened in like 2008, and I remember that, and I thought the whole world economic system was gonna implode and cease to function. And if the government hadn't have stepped in, it probably would have done that.
We would have gone to an underground system,
Yeah. So,
and
like, yeah, there's a lot of systemic problems, like with water and lending and banks and whatnot. I just see the government stepping in and propping things up. But if there's not
bailing us all
water,
out of our sins, huh?
but if the water's not there, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the water's not there. We've seen over the last 2 years of COVID, a lot of people leaving California, some people leaving the East Coast, blue states. A lot of them went to Texas. I'm not going to say a whole lot of them came to this part of Kansas, maybe up towards, the east side, northeast side of the state where there's already too many people. I, I mentioned I had some friends that had a place in northeast Colorado earlier. And when we met them, that was kind of a concern. Like they mentioned that they had some water issues. And we're like, well, maybe you ought to get that well tested. Maybe see, maybe make sure that if you want to continue to do this business here and make a life for yourselves here, that you're going to have water to run an agricultural business. Came back a couple months later, they couldn't get any confidence in their water supply in that well, which ultimately led to them getting out of that property. Who bought it? Don't know. What are they doing with it? Doesn't really matter. There's a threshold of water that's required, to keep livestock, especially in some of the artificial systems that we have. And you can do a lot of that with rainwater. We don't drink rainwater in general. I mean, if we do, it's, out of a lake, has to be filtered, but we have to have infrastructure for our water. We have to be able to pump it. We have to be able to filter it, and there has to be enough of it. And areas like, the Front Range Mountains in Colorado, Colorado Springs, Denver's running out of water. Colorado Springs doesn't quite have enough. I saw something come across my news feed the other day. I think it's like St. George, Utah, or Salt Lake City, or somewhere up in that area. One of the fastest growing urban areas in the United States. They already don't have enough water for the people that are there, but they're like, oh yeah, come on, move here. It's a great place to live. Yeah, what happens when we run out of water? Or what happens when there's just slightly not enough? And we might get it. Well, I was up until about a month ago, I said we might get a taste of that in the desert Southwest with the Colorado River kind of not having enough moisture in it, not having enough moisture in a Colorado River drainage to refill Mead and Powell and be able to provide irrigation water out of that system. Like, we talk about the Ogallala aquifer and overuse of that. Like, over allocation of Colorado River water is like, that's a whole other can of worms.
Mhm.
And I go back to that, the area of quote poor natural resources. To me, that's rainfall. It's the Mountain West and it's the plains. And the reason things are going to have to change. The cost of everything is going to go up. The technology, it's going to become harder and harder to pump the water out, to find it, to keep it clean, especially the more people we get, and it's going to become a scarcer resource. And I think about what the area looked like before Europeans came. You know, there were Native Americans that lived all the way on the West Coast. There were Native Americans that had cities and civilizations on the 98th meridian and east.
Mm-hmm.
The plains and the mountains. I mean, okay, yeah, there's like the Navajo and the Hopi tribes. They had cities. Northern Rocky Mountains, nothing. The plains, I mean, I think you and I both know that the Comanches wouldn't tolerate any crap, and they didn't have any towns. So the Comanche were a nomadic people. The history of the plains has been that of nomadic peoples, of nomadic animals. So I guess what I'm saying is, you know, are we if we're not really meant to live in these areas because they are deficient in natural resources and in rainfall? Should we maybe be looking at more of a nomadic lifestyle, or what does that say about what does that say to you about our future here on the plains?
Well, first of all, Brian, I think that we have a lot to learn from the Mongolians.
Okay.
The ability to move around and regain that. I think um, if the experiment of great cities on the plains doesn't work, which the odds are in favor that they will work, because we're going to spend an enormous amount of natural resource dollars and new technology to try to keep them alive. But if we're really thinking about how would it be if there were many, many fewer people on the plains, then you end up back to a hunter-gatherer grass-based society of where maybe because of governments and they're wanting to harvest taxes, that maybe we need grass in 3 or 4 places in the plains instead of one spot like a sitting duck waiting for the drought to come. So that changes the way we move our animals. Um, there's certainly nothing wrong with the idea of being further north in the summer and further south in the winter. And I mean, there's something comforting for everyone that gets to experience that. Um, but I mean, it's just like being, if you're in the extreme northern plains pushing up into Canada, some of those guys have had to feed a lot of feed this winter because of the amount of snow they've had. They don't get that every year, but the year it comes, they either have to put wheels under the animals or they have to feed them. And I think if we really could find systems that are much more flexible, I think that buys us a lot of longevity in the plains. I mean, I think there will be people who choose to be more nomadic if that's what it takes, even if we're maybe you have a place in, maybe you have so many acres in Texas, so many acres in Kansas, so many acres in Nebraska, so many acres in South Dakota, on up into Wyoming or Montana or wherever it is on the east side of the Rockies. Um, I think that's probably a model that has merit, because the truth of it is, if we look at weather patterns, as the easterlies, which are on the equator and the poles, and when they speed up, the westerlies slow down, and when they slow down, the westerlies speed up. If I'm remembering this right, and it seems to me that most of the time when North Dakota, South Dakota are in extreme drought, we're still tolerable. And usually when we're in extreme drought here on the Southern Plains, North Dakota, South Dakota is coming out of it and they're doing better. We kind of flip flop back and forth. And you talk about how it was before modern civilization. Well, the animals migrated to the green grass. The people and those of us humans that were getting to be the predators at the time, chasing them to try to catch one of them, we migrated with them. And I think it's a beautiful system, and I don't know, I don't think we'll go back to that totally, but I think mimicry, geographic mimicry, has a place probably, of mimicking the idea that, and maybe you don't have to own it. Maybe you have maybe it's through information sharing of who's got extra grass, and quit thinking of terms of a static livestock population. Maybe I'm making that mistake on our properties, that maybe we're thinking too much in terms of a static livestock population, and maybe a more fluid model is more appropriate. From a grazing perspective, it certainly is. I mean, right now we're still in great shape feed wise for another till the end of the summer. If we don't get a rain till the end of the summer, that's when I really start getting in big trouble. But because we've got enough brown ahead of us to keep us going.
Yeah,
But
I know how that feels. Like I have brown grass till July 15th ish, and yeah, that's when I'm out of grass if it doesn't rain anymore.
that's when the trucks come, right?
That's
We can sell so many to friends to slaughter, and the rest they have to go somewhere else.
it's not written in stone on the calendar, but it's definitely penciled in, and I've got my eye on that date. Is like that's the day we run out of grass.
You got your road closure signs so you can graze the bar ditches for about 2 more weeks.
Oh man, I wish I did. Hey, let's get some made real quick. The old timers used to call that the long pasture.
We're
That's
going to hurt them down because we can't afford diesel for the truck.
I you say that, and like it kind of like makes me half remember a story somebody used to told me about. A guy was like, well, out of grass on the ranch, got to take him to town, might as well graze the whole way there. And he like drove his cattle 20 odd miles to town down the ditches, and he stayed with them the whole time, slept with them out there and everything, like a 2-day trip to get him to town. Got him to town, sold him at the barn, turned around and rode home.
He probably had less strength than everybody else.
Hell, he probably had gain on the way there.
So that's the goal.
Yeah. It blows my mind that, on the cattle drives, the Loving Goodnight Trail and all the cattle drive trails, those guys would take cows from farther south than you are, drive them past where I'm at, and they'd gain 2 pounds a day the whole trip.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and now we've got to have these modern genetics that'll do 2 pounds a day on corn in a feedlot, and that's what they're going to do. And like, we're calling that progress, right? Anyway,
I think your modern genetics that a lot of people allude to. I think there's two things going on in the cattle deal that people. I think that people are getting caught not paying attention to frame size and body type, and there's a value to smaller framed, and I remember um, a friend of ours, actually, when the Chianinas, when I was a child, He bought the grand champion bull at the National Western, and it was a Chianina by the name of Apollo.
Okay.
And he was a giant ox. And he would have been the Mack truck of wagon trains had you had it when people were crossing the country. He would have been terrific at pulling a wagon across America. I don't know what his eating experience would have been.
Just cook it a little lower and a little slower, and it'll be all right.
We'll get that. Carne es carne, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. But if we think about today, this trend toward smaller frame, more moderate cattle, I think as we go forward, I think whatever genetic tools that people are, whether they're testing them survival of the fittest on their property or they're looking at other things, I think moderation is going to be the answer for a lot of people. And whether and landrace cattle, just like landrace sheep and things like that, they have a place. Landrace plant genetics have a place. And that's probably the big advantage of these little sustainable farmers we talk about on a small shareholder deal.
When you say land race cattle, land race sheep, what do you? I'm not familiar with that term.
I'm talking, okay, they are the products. Okay, so Brian, if you have your cow herd and you've maintained your cow herd for eons of time in your neighborhood, and you didn't introduce a lot of outside stuff, and you just keep selecting the best of the best that were adapted to your environment, you end up with your own land race of animal, not land race like pigs, but a true land race. It's truly developed on that land, and the genetics that survived have learned to match that. And there is a huge advantage to developing our own land races of animals and utilizing and thinking about where our holes are in our problems and only looking at any exterior genetic introduction for the purpose of, oh my gosh, I have a problem. Who can I go to that might have something that I can bring in here to help fix this problem? And other than that, let them be, and just keep moving forward, trying to improve them slowly through themselves. Um, and I am not one to talk because I haven't fully experimented long enough thinking through it, but I know on plants, plants can get pretty adapted to an area if you just keep selecting the best seeds every time. And I think that if we're going to survive economically in places like the plains, I think we need to be looking at those things that cut cost. The old Bert Teichert type of deal of minimizing the overheads. Well, a $400 bag of corn seed that has all the traits, yes, it may produce more, but it's going to take a lot more corn to pay for that bag. And maybe developing land race plants has some merit. It may be building land race hybrids of our own, where this land race is, I have two lines of land races and they're a little different. And maybe my optimum goal is my F1 that I'm going to crossbreed the two. So maybe I have a big group of the one of my maternal, and I got 10 or 20 of these tough suckers that survive that give me a little bit more growth that I throw on my cows when I need it, when it's green. I keep their sons and I throw them out there and when it gets dry again, I take a knife to every one of them again. Maybe there's ways we need to think about it, because if we use all our resources up to feed everyone, and we have to realize agriculture is an extractive industry, that we won't feed it. We'll fail at our job if we're not careful. Now, I'm not that negative. I really deep down think that the opportunities are huge to think about ways of cutting costs, thinking about things we can do to fit our environment better, thinking about irrigating within a balance of what our rainfall is. So we have good well capacities so we're not just gutting it. And I think that most people fail to realize that on the plains, that the majority of agriculture is rain fed, not irrigated. And those families that have been doing rain fed agriculture eat just as well as everyone else.
Probably
They
sleep a little
really
better
have.
at night because the banknote isn't as big.
Mm-hmm.
I know. I know just some of the farmers that I know around here, and them talking about their fuel bills for irrigation engine just staggers me. And then I hear about how much water they've pumped. You know, and I don't know any of the numbers off the top of my head with any kind of accuracy to be able to talk about, but it seems like an awful lot of fuel, and seems like an awful lot of fuel. And I kind of circle back to the comment I made earlier. We're going to use energy that's millions of years old to pump water that's thousands of years old to grow corn that we can ship to make ethanol, or grow a cow, or to an ethanol plant where we can make a fuel that's less energy dense and not shelf stable.
The cost, you start thinking cost. I will tell you the number. You think about how cheap fossil energy still is in our country.
Yeah.
And to give you an idea, down here, a lot of people will use the number of, say, just a random number of $15 to pump an acre inch. An acre inch is 27,154 gallons. Okay. Now, here's a different way of looking at it. The value of a gallon of water for civilization, not for food production, is probably 1 to 2 cents per gallon. So you think about that. So it's worth $271. That's right. At a penny. Double check that math. I think that's right. Make sure that's right. Yeah, it's worth $271.54 at a penny a gallon, that acre inch.
And they're saying it's worth $15.
No, it costs you $15 to pump it out. The pumping cost is not the issue. In a crop production deal, I know one of our friends at Vernon presented some data on it last year, and he showed it for a $15 expenditure for pumping, you got about a $60 return on crop. So they're netting about $45 an acre for every inch they pump if they're not wasting a drop of it. Now, unfortunately, there's no agricultural system that's perfect. Okay, the cost that's not attributed is the replacement cost of that water or its other value cost. So if you're at a 2 cent per gallon valuation, say you've got a need, and even in oil and gas, they're doing oil water for 1 to 2 cents a gallon. So if you have water that's worth 550, just say 2 cents a gallon, it's $553 an acre inch. That costs you $15 to do. So you got a net of nearly $530 an acre inch. Well, if you take 20 inches to burn up $500 worth of water to grow an acre of high irrigated crop, we grew $2,000 or $3,000 worth of crop for $10,000 worth of water expense. It's ultimately really tough math at the end of the day. And we're not talking going down the step of ethanol that turns into, you know, that turns a third into CO2, a third into ethanol, and a third into feed product, the bushel of corn that goes there. So what is it? Is 43% of the U.S. corn crop goes to ethanol, I believe. Is that right?
I,
Something like that.
I won't argue with 43. I've heard around 40%.
Mm-hmm.
It's like 80% to cat, or 40% to livestock, 40% to ethanol, and then like 18% other uses, and 2% for human consumption. I think as far as total U.S. corn crop.
Well, if you think about that 40% for livestock, and you take a third of the ethanol goes back to livestock, So it really puts you close to 54, 55% going toward livestock
Yeah, and
in the hogs and chickens and cattle and feedlots.
yeah, and I would imagine that a lot of the byproduct from those ethanol plants, distillers grains,
It all goes. That's
it
one.
all goes. I mean, I think, the corn, a lot of the corn and beans, in quote biofuel crops, still end up as forage and feedstuffs for livestock somehow, because after they go through the ethanol plant, what are they going to do with the distillers grains? It's not like they're going to go throw them back on the field. No, it's edible. Might as well take it to a feedlot and feed it to cows.
That's why putting those plants in places, even though they're not near the corn production, in places where there's feeding, made a lot of sense to people that were putting them in. You know, we ship it this far, it gets sold as feed. Part of it gets sold as feed, and then we ship it the rest away is in tankers as ethanol. But you think about it, if you took the ethanol fraction out of the market, there's a big chunk of the United States we wouldn't necessarily have to use for grain production and still be able to feed ourselves very well, you know. So some of it's job creation and some of it's the idea that we need it for feed, but reality is just moving resources around.
It's generally what government programs are, is their jobs programs for other people.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So
so,
you got good fencing crew ideas or jobs programs?
no, not without spending a bunch of somebody else's money, which is again another function of government. So let's tell me your transition system, and your transition system from where you were in 2010, irrigated crops, 60 circles, to where you're at today, and talk about what you've learned, because I'd hope that there's more than one or two other people listening to this podcast that are where you were in 2010, that and maybe not exactly where you were, but so picture this: commodity farmer with a bunch of circles, doesn't have a lot of great fence, wanting to make the shift that you started to make 13 years ago. So maybe kind of frame the discussion, like that way.
Okay, that's easy. What we did, we basically you pick a spot, preferably, on some land that's going to have the least negative impact on your finances, and start moving away from crop production there. Um, you know, if you can do that, and it seems like those areas, those lesser productive areas, are actually the easiest ones to get grass established on. I don't fully understand why. I know Dale Strickler and I talked about it and looked at it, and it's a fascinating deal. The more irrigation water it's been on a field, the harder it is to get native grasses to grow back on it. The longer it takes. It's a weird scenario without irrigation, that is. I
Is
don't know
that
if it's
maybe
salt or if it's excessive nutrients. We tend to think it's excessive nutrients because we live where we live. We have a lot of our soils have relatively high phosphate levels, which is probably a little bit antimycorrhizal. Um, and yet we can get other plants to grow there. It takes us longer to get the mycorrhizal fungi, is what I'm going to say, established on those formerly heavily fertilized irrigated fields than on the dryland areas. Um,
Have you done any soil testing or anything to kind of correlate some of that?
no, we're working on that. That's kind of where we're going.
It's
We
expensive, I get it.
and we have lots of previous uh data on the soil test. What we have seen as we move toward getting our organic matter stabilized in those fields, which means or move up, or as they move upward more by the elimination of, when you eliminate the tillage and you started moving back that direction, it takes a little bit of time for your organic matters to really start reading true, and they do move up. They do move up, And that transition from crops and with intermittent fallow bare periods, or back to weeds and grasses and covers. We to say we don't do covers, that's not truthful. We have had really good luck with some things like some black oats and Troy oats and dairy oats and a little bit of barley and things like that, along with to try to establish grasses. I mean, we've had really good luck doing that with those perennials. Um, Much better than a killed cover often times. I mean, I've been putting those in with the more species of grasses we put in with our perennials. It just seems like we get them started better, which is totally counterintuitive, and I can't explain why. It may be just on ours that it works that way, but we went down that road of you start moving that direction by getting, whether you're putting wheat or oats or sorghums or something like that, and leaving that residue there. And then in our area, the ideal time that we plant grasses is any time from December 1st till actually into early June is actually our best window. That we have a big window to plant it. So planter capacity is not a real big issue. Um, and you just keep moving that direction. The problem you run into is your first few years is that when you go from crop income to just expenditure trying to get things changed over to the point where you can have some more livestock income. You can get livestock income pretty quick because that's um, that's a pretty good way to manage the excessive above ground biomass is flash grazing.
Yep.
Had really good luck even early on, when the grass establishment period, just flash graze it, let some hoof action out there and get across it and keep rolling. So you get some income, but you're changing your income streams, your income timings, and those are the things that make it difficult. But what we've seen uh, from our perspective is imagine the acres that we've moved away from being dependent upon crop insurance checks. Um, Now that doesn't benefit me, but that certainly benefits my fellow man or fellow American if they know they're not having to subsidize quite as many acres for droughts and things like that. Because quite frankly, even though crop production's been harder, forage production's still been pretty decent during this dry period we're in right now. I mean, we didn't get any rain till the end of July, and we got July, August, and then a little bit, and then some early September rains, and then it shut off again. But in that 6 to 8 week period, we pretty much grew. It's where we were talking about earlier about timing of rainfall. Yes, it was theoretically too late for us, and yet we grew enough grass that it bought us another year. I mean, it bought us a year for that period. So it's amazing how efficient those grasses are that can put a seed head out that can go from laying there essentially dormant because they don't have enough moisture to really green up to putting a seed head out and being well past the early stages of production. 30 to 60 days, those grasses are moving on. And we can't do that with most cultivated crops. It's not like wheat we plant in September, October, and we harvest it in June or July, or corn we plant in April or May and we harvest it in September, October, November. I mean, all those take way more than 30 to 60 days to get from emergence to seed to full finished seed. And I think that's the advantage of those types of grasses. All those native species that you've talked about. I mean, some of them take longer than that, but have you seen on places where in Kansas where y'all been, um, have you, if, how often do you see it where they don't, are they, have you seen anybody that just let it go back to grass on its own?
As far as a farm field,
Yes.
um, I'm gonna say no. I don't have any like direct firsthand knowledge of that. So when we started talking, my ranch is about 7,000 acres and it's all grass. And I can look on Google Earth and I can come up with pretty close to 500 acres that were farmed at one point in time across the acres that I'm controlling now. There's only about 340 of 340 acres according to the Farm Service Agency of this ranch that
Farm.
was ever farmed. So some of it, obviously, some of it in my mind would have gone back before the Farm Service Agency was ever established. So I think there were some early homesteaders out here that broke out some hilltops, farmed around them. There's like the farming ridge around the top of the hilltop.
Uh-huh.
Big erosion gully, blow through blow through it on each side, go down, fill up the canyon. I've got that in a couple places. So when my dad came out here to take over this land full time in late 1984, there still was a couple of farm fields on the south end, and that was one of the first things he did because only the only farm tractor that he got out of the whole meal deal was a 65 horsepower open cab Massey Ferguson tractor that dated back to the mid 50s.
Awesome.
I mean, there was probably a couple small farm implements around here that were not very serviceable because the ranch spent like 10 years in receivership while they were working out of state issues with the court. So like for 10 years it was just kind of like this is what it is, and that land that ground really wasn't farmed, I don't think. So when dad took it over in the mid 80s, he just planted it all back to grass. He didn't know what else to do. He's just like, well, I'll just plant it all back to grass. And the thing to do at the time, he told me this a year or two ago, is he went and he borrowed the grass drill. Tractor wouldn't pull it, so he just put the pickup in 4 low and first gear and got a bottle of tequila, and he just drove around out there and planted grass. And at the time, it was just grass seed. Just grass seed. And a lot of that ground really struggled until the early 2000s, and I think it was 98 or 99. Dad went back and got some forbs and planted some forbs in there.
Okay.
Y'all, forbs are probably what most of y'all call pasture weeds. Okay, there's no such thing as a weed. It's all just different kinds of cow feed. So that's when he planted the forbs in there, then some of the taller native grasses started to come back. Couple of fires, change up how we did grazing, went to faster moves, shorter graze periods, higher stock densities, more paddocks. And the more we lean on that, the better the grass gets in those old farm field areas. So there's, what really made the change? Was it the forb seed? Was it the change in management? Was it the fire? Or was it the combination of all of them? Well, from other ranches, I think it has to be kind of a combination of most of that. You got to rebuild the seed bank, has to be grazed properly, and then when it does start to kind of come back, I think our native grasses out here, they need to have some kind of fire component periodically, in order to give them the right biological signals, in order to give those grass plants the right biological signals, and maybe it has something to do with the soil microbiome. I'm not real sure, but
You,
go ahead.
you see that do you see that same thing with heavy grazing? See, I think in our area we're so anti-fire, and I don't think fire is bad, but I know that extremely hard wintertime grazing, and we get some moisture behind that, even in where it's a solid stand of weeds, we'll start seeing the grass come in the off season, not the green grazing, but in the brown grazing season. That the harder we can be on it during the brown grazing, sometimes that hell really wakes it up and stimulates it to turn to grass.
I would agree. I would generally agree. And I'll also say that I don't really think that during the dorrant season, when all your grass is brown, that it's really possible to do overgrazing. Like
Exactly, but that's
overgrazing's not a thing in December.
that's a common complaint of people that are tilling ground near us. Or they see that. Well, I mean, we run about 600 females in one group, okay, and they see those 600 females trampling in that thing and beating it. I mean, we are not consistent on. There are some fields we purposely leave them longer because of the type of residue that's there to try to really, if we see some more oxidation there or whatnot, I want to get rid of that oxidation. I want every bit of it gone before I go to the next field, even though I may give up some animal performance. If it's doing it when the calf's in the belly and the calf is not on the ground, I don't see as much negative effect of doing that to that animal. And it's just like the body condition score of the cow. If she gets skinnier in the wintertime, but she still has enough nutrients to make it and produce a good healthy calf and get the calf born, and the spring flush, maybe the calf is born right at the beginning of the spring flush or something like that. If we get one of those spring flushes, which we most of the time we get something, um, that seems to be more ideal. I mean, it just seems like these cows are tougher than we give them credit a lot of times. They're a lot tougher than we give them credit. And that biocycling from skinny to fat throughout the year, I think it actually enhances longevity, not decreases longevity, because you get some extra weight off those bones and joints that they don't need to carry all the time. It's just like bulls that have way too much fat in their testicles. You start getting subpar fertility, where if they work it off and I'm not saying work it off during the breeding season, but if they're out on a pasture that in a grazing scenario that their nutrients levels go up and they go back down, and spring's coming and breeding season's coming in the later summer, that they're on a higher plane of nutrition, well, their fertility will recover just fine most of the time. I mean, if it's I think feeding our way to a constant body condition score is economically unviable in my book.
You can feed condition and fertility into anything. Like you just got to get your checkbook out. And you know, to tag in with what you're saying about body condition, yeah, there's a lot of guys that think you got to keep them cows in a 5 or 6 all year. You know, when you got to have that cow at a body condition 6 prior to calving. Um, I think some of that is out of date. I go back to
Absolutely.
and I think Bert Teichert is who I heard this from first. He said, as long as that cow is on a rising plane of condition, she'll start cycling. So that means if you've got, you know, if your cows are 3s and they're moving towards 4s and 5s, they're going to be fertile and cycling. But if your cow's at a 6 and maintaining a 6, she's going to be less likely to cycle and less fertile during those cycles. That's the way I interpret that.
That's exactly how I interpret it.
Okay, now I wanted to loop back around to burning because
Yes. Burning versus over heavy grazing.
so my thoughts are this. You know, we I said I don't feel like overgrazing in the dormant season is a thing. Like brown grass, graze it down, leave them in there a month, whatever. You know, watch for other signs of when you're going to move rather than how much forage they're taking or how many days they've been there. So yes, theoretically, if we're in an ultra high stock density type, you know, grazing system, you know, 50,000 pound, okay, I'd put the floor of that at 25,000 pounds per acre. That's where I consider ultra high density grazing start. I see you're making notes. um, and I think 50 is a good place to be. Like if you can manage about 50, if you've got the forage for 50,000 pounds an acre stock density on a daily move, that's probably about where you are. That's about where I am. You know, some years it's, you know, a little closer to 40, 42. Some years it's probably a little more than that. Anyway, so as we're marching across, you know, moving daily and really concentrating that stock density, you know, okay, if we're eating a quarter of it, we're peeing on a quarter of it, we're pooping on a quarter of it, and we're laying on the other quarter of it. What what burning primarily does, for those of y'all that aren't big into fire culture and practitioners of, not even going to talk about like brush management with fire, just what it does for the grass. So if you go, like, generally here in southern Kansas, if I burn, regardless of what the rainfall is, I will have greater grass production per inch of rainfall in the year after a fire. And that's kind of like on a 5-year diminishing returns.
Okay.
So after about 5-6 years after fire, I'm kind of down to baseline production. And if I want to boost that, I got to run a fire across it. There's also the argument to be made that, you know, that the unused forage that does start to oxidize. And what that looks like to me is when the understory of your plant is no longer brown, when it starts to be gray and black, that's when those plants are decadent and they're oxidizing, and that material static. It's not palatable to cattle anymore. Nothing's going to eat it. And the way to reset that is either stomp it into the ground and pee on it, or put fire on it. And if you put fire on it, that has the added benefit of resetting that plant's growth cycle and sending better growth signals down to that plant, and you end up with more nutritious forage than you would if you just grazed it down to dirt. That's just been my experience. Now, granted, a lot of the quote ice cream grass that we're going to have that's come back real strong after fire is going to be Indian grass and big blue stem grass, which both of those are extremely sensitive to overgrazing. So burning, I think burning definitely, there's always pluses. There's always pros and cons to everything we want to look at. And I think that, that burning as a management practice definitely should have a place in the toolbox of a land manager on the plains. The trick is figuring out the correct context in which to apply the fire. Right?
Mm-hmm. Burn ban, too much wind. But real context is if you can how much trouble have you gotten in going ahead of a drought?
I think
Is it not really matter that much?
you can put yourself in a hell of a crack burning going into a drought and not managing well.
Okay.
Like we've got the oldest prescribed burn group in the state, oldest organized prescribed burn group in the state. I know because I helped organize it. And we didn't burn anything last year. Normally, if we turn back to 2019, I think we did 15 burns as a group, and something like 30,000 acres, I think we got burned that year. 2020 was a lot less. There was nothing last year, and there's likely to be nothing again this year. Well, I'll take that back. There were a few burns last year. There were no dormant season burns last year. Nobody was brave enough to burn in the dormant season. The few people that did burn, burned in late June and in July and August.
Okay.
So growing season burns are starting to be more of a thing. And yeah, like, here in the middle plains, we're recording this, it's beginning of March. In a normal year, our burn season would be basically opening about now. Now would be about the time that guys would be starting to look, now till about April 15th, which is kind of when that window starts closing. What we found is that if you wait till literal summer, like after the third week of June, you'll still have that oxidized, decadent, ungrazable, unpalatable stuff down at your understory, but it's surrounded by green. And you find a day that's about 7 to 10 mile an hour worth of wind, where it's, not 100 degrees and not under 20% humidity. It's a pretty easy fire to control because you've got a lot of green growth already down there, and the fire just kind of goes over the green and burns all the brown stuff out. So we've had pretty good luck with summer burns. Early summer, late summer, I've done them both and been happy either way. Not all on my place, but neighbors. It's nothing to just take take a little 10-minute road trip and go drive past neighbor's pasture. And I know when they were burnt. Kind of have a rough idea, how they have cows in it. But yeah, I spend a lot of time driving around and looking at what ground looks like and thinking back to the burns that we did on that ground, and looking at the plants that are there. So I guess that's kind of my 2 cents on burning. Man, we've been at this dang near 2 hours. Couple questions, couple questions I want to ask you about your vet practice. How much you have a practice? So it's not like you're not a feedlot vet, right? You don't go to a feedlot and work every day. Do I have that right?
That's correct. I do. Here's what we have. Yes, I have a couple clients that well, we do have a I tend to do work in the neighborhood as far as large animal veterinary medicine services, testing bulls, posting dead cattle, checking, just whatever. Uh, and yes, some of them are tied to a confined feeding. Some are tied to stocker, some are tied to cow calf. And in our mix of our practice, though, we do a lot of companion animal medicine, which also includes herding dogs and guard dogs and things like that. So we're kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, but do a fair amount of surgery and things like that. So it's a totally different direction than our farming day-to-day life. It's wearing different hats in the community.
There for a second, I thought you were going to tell me that no, I don't do large animals at all. I'm a small animal vet. And squirrels and reptiles are my thing. Anyway,
And actually, from an economics perspective, if you were truthful to yourself, that would probably be the best way to subsidize the next generation coming into ranching. Would be to be that exotic vet in the next nearest town because it's going to be a rare bird.
oh, people will pay way more to try to fix a dog than they would to try to fix a cow.
Yeah, I think it's a real, I kind of like the Australians' view of large animal medicine to some degree that if it can't fix itself, eliminate it. And that's horrible to say that, but that I am one of those people. And people look at me like, what do you mean you don't pull calves on your cows? Well, I very seldom pull a calf on a cow because we have selected and put a herd together of livestock that we don't have to pull very many animals, like ever. And no, we do not calve next to the house because they're always on the move. So, and we also run sheep, and we will intervene in our sheep, but partly that is because we have added some additional genetics that we didn't have before, and we want to kind of watch how they come about to see if we added a problem in. I think we actually probably added in better animals durability wise than what we already had. So I think that's a good thing. So it's a funny deal. So yes, I'll take $400 or $800 to do a C-section on your dog, Brian.
Okay.
Since you're but I know you'll be mad at me if I charge more than $100 on the cow, and I can't do that.
Gosh, we humans sure are funny things, aren't we?
Yeah, the part that feeds us, we don't feed back, and the part that doesn't feed us, we give everything to.
But I love my dog, and that's just a cow.
They're all God's creatures.
Yeah, man, there's so much we didn't even talk about. I'm glad I made like a page and a half worth of prompts and notes because I didn't even look at them.
I'm sorry I messed up your schedule here.
Oh, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. We'll just have to have you. We'll just plenty of stuff to talk about if I can ever convince you to do this again.
Wonderbar.
Well, anything you want to close with?
I think that the future is bright as long as we realize what the current situation is. And that's on so many levels of life. Anybody needs to, maybe has a question or comment about it or has an idea for me. I mean, I'm pretty open with my contact. It's 806-344-5111. That is a cell phone. Text me and I'll call you back at my earliest convenience. That's usually the easiest way to get a hold of me. Just send me a text or an email, which is my last name, Grotegut @WTRT.net. And
At trt.net?
WTRT.net. West Texas Rural Telephone.net is what that stands for. And God bless America and apple pie and all those good things that go along with it. And good luck to those that are trying to figure out how to adapt to the future of the plains.
Oh, it's going to be interesting, that's for sure. I'm looking forward to it.
It'll be exciting. It'll be exciting.
All right. I appreciate your time today, Chris. And we are recording this on a Friday, so I'll let you go start your weekend. And the rest of you all out there in podcast land, you guys go get on with your week.
Back to work. See you, Brian.
On with your week.
Back to work. See you, Brian.
See you, Chris.